Some places have a warning built right into the name, but what you do with that information is up to you. In the far northwest corner of Canada, the South Nahanni River cuts through a stretch of wilderness so remote that most of it has never been seen by human eyes. The river runs through a chain of canyons with limestone walls that rise more than 3,000 feet straight up on both sides. Higher than almost any canyon walls on the continent, and those walls are full of caves. Black openings in the rock, hundreds of feet above the water, stacked into cliff faces no climber has ever been able to reach. Nobody knows how deep they actually go. And for over a century, that valley has claimed many victims. In 1908, two brothers named Willie and Frank McLeod went up the Nahanni prospecting for gold. Their bodies, or what was left of them, were found beside the river. Both men were missing their heads. 9 years later, a prospector named Martin Jorgensen built a cabin upstream. The cabin burned to the ground, and Jorgensen's body was found nearby, again without its head. In the years that followed, it kept happening. A trapper found dead in his sleeping bag, headless. Men who walked into the valley well supplied, rugged, and experienced were simply never seen again. This area on the map has many names, but one stands out: the Valley of the Headless Men. The Dene people who have lived in that region for thousands of years had a name for what was up there. They spoke of a tribe called the Naha, a mountain people who lived not along the rivers, but high up in the caves, and they only came down at night to hunt. According to legend, without any warning, the Naha just vanished. An entire tribe gone. No battle, no explanation. The Dene have avoided that valley for long before the prospectors started turning up dead. In August of 2015, two experienced kayakers named Jake and Mark flew into that wilderness for a multi-day trip down the deepest stretch of the canyons. Both of them have traversed harder water than the Nahanni, and neither of them thought much about the name on the map. Stories like that never live up to the hype. Until now. For the first 2 days, the river gave them exactly the trip they'd come for. Fast-paced and technical, cold water, warm campfires, and canyon walls that kept getting taller the deeper you went, until the sky was a thin ribbon of gray directly overhead, and the sun reached the river for a couple hours a day. By the third day, they were into the deepest section, the part where the walls go full vertical, and the only way out of the canyon is downstream. Around midday, they pulled onto a gravel bar to rest and eat. Jake refilled their water at the river's edge. Mark wandered toward the base of the cliff, stretching his legs. At about 30 feet from the water, something in the rocks caught his eye. It was half buried in the gravel, and when he pulled it out and brushed it off, he was holding what appeared to be carved from a single piece of bone, smooth and dark with age, small enough to close his fist around. On one side, carved into bone, was a face, and not a pleasant one. Whoever had carved it had cut the mouth unnaturally wide, like it was screaming, but wider, like its jaw was dislocated and hanging. Mark turned it over a few times, grinned, and showed it to Jake. An Aztec death whistle. But Canada was a strange place to find such a treasure. Mark thought he hit the jackpot. He couldn't have been more wrong. An hour later, a storm came. Weather in that valley doesn't just roll in. It punches you square in the face without warning. The rain came down so hard that it hurt. The wind funneled between the walls and the water started rising fast. The rapids ahead of them, which had been well within their skill set that morning, turned into something even the most experienced kayakers would never attempt. But there was nowhere to go. This section was wall-to-wall river. There was nowhere to pull off. There was nowhere to go but forward. About halfway through, Mark's kayak slammed into a rock and nearly split in two. It was taking on water fast. He had to bail. Jake fought through the current and got a hold of him, and the two of them dragged themselves and the wreckage onto a narrow gravel bank about 200 yards downstream, pinned between the flooded river and the base of the cliff. Mark was banged up but alive. His boat was in pieces. Jake's kayak survived, but was only suitable for one man, and definitely wouldn't survive another attempt at those rapids. They got on their Garmin inReach, and dispatch told them what they already suspected. The storm had grounded every aircraft in the region, and nobody was flying into a canyon in that weather. A helicopter would come at first light if the skies cleared up. So they made camp. They run out their gear, built a fire against the base of the cliff, and settled in for what would soon be the longest night of their lives, with 3,000 feet of rock at their backs and a rising river in front of them. Sometime around midnight, the rain thinned to a drizzle, and Mark remembered his whistle. He dug it out of his pocket and held it up to the firelight, turning it so Jake could see the screaming face carved into the bone. And before Jake could say a word, Mark put it to his lips and blew. The sound that came out of it was not a whistle. It was almost like a scream, a high-pitched, ragged human scream. So loud and so wrong that Mark nearly dropped the thing. It echoed off 3,000 feet of rock until it sounded like a dozen people screaming down at them from the dark. But echoes eventually fade. This got louder. More voices joining in by the second, coming from high above them in the cliffs. There was dozens of them now, overlapping into a frenzy. Both men stood frozen at the fire as they understood at the same moment that the sound was no longer coming from the whistle. The whistle hadn't echoed off the canyon. It had woke something up. All at once, the screaming stopped and dropped into a chant, low, rhythmic, many voices all in unison, rolling down from somewhere high in the rock face. Jake stepped back from the fire and looked up, searching the black cliff face. He found a light. Deep inside one of the caves, hundreds of feet above the river, a fire was burning. And across that lit opening, shadows were moving. Then one of the shadows came out of the cave and started to climb down. Now, when I say climbing, that doesn't do it justice. Mark nor Jake has ever seen anything move like this. It moved down that rock face effortlessly and fast. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it just jumped. It was a pale figure coming down that sheer rock face in total silence. No ropes, no gear. One by one, they poured from the cave system. A dozen of them at least, and they were fast. They spread out across the cliff as they descended, almost in an ambush formation. The men killed their fire and pressed their backs into the dark at the base of the wall. There was nowhere to go. The river was in a frenzy. The canyon wall was, well, a wall. They watched the figures reach the bottom of the gorge, drop onto the rocks without a sound, and begin to spread out along the bank in the darkness. Some dove into the river and disappeared. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing moved. Mark was standing closest to the water when suddenly something rose out of the dark beside him, grabbed a hold of his ankle, and pulled him into the river before he could make a single sound. Jake lunged for him and caught nothing but a handful of ice-cold water. He screamed Mark's name into the dark until his voice gave out. Mark was gone. Jake spent the next hour with his back against the cliff, hunting knife in hand, soaked and shaking, watching the darkness where the water met the gravel, but nothing ever came. He could feel them more than he could see them, just outside of his view. He knew they were there, but for some reason, they never advanced. The chanting above him raged on. The fire in the cave seemed to grow by the minute. He never heard any footsteps around him, never saw any movement, but that meant nothing to Jake. They were still out there. About 2 hours into the most horrifying experience of Jake's life, he heard footsteps in the gravel a few feet away, and a figure emerged from the darkness. As it stepped into the firelight, Jake saw a man, pale as the limestone behind it, and completely still. It didn't grab him, it didn't make a sound. It stood there a few feet from Jake and stared straight through him. Somehow, through the fear, Jake understood exactly what it was waiting for, which as he did it, he thought how ridiculous that idea was. Him? A threat to them? He crawled across the gravel to Mark's pack, dug out the bone whistle with numb, frozen hands, and held it up with both palms open like a peace offering. The figure stared at him longer than Jake hoped he would. Then he took the whistle. Half relieved and half terrified, Mark stood face to face with the Naha warrior for what felt like an hour. Then it turned around, walked to the base of the cliff, and climbed back up into the darkness without once looking back. Jake frantically searched for his brother, but he knew there was little chance Mark could have survived those rapids in a kayak, let alone without one. The helicopter came at dawn and lifted Jake out. Search teams flew the canyon twice in the days that followed, and boats dragged the river below for a week. The official report lists Mark as a presumed drowning. His body was never recovered. Investigators had a hard time with Jake's story. The walls are too sheer, the openings are too high, And even if they believed him, the funding for that kind of search just doesn't exist for a drowning. Whatever is inside that canyon remains a mystery to everyone except Jake. The Dene say the Naha vanished from this earth long ago, and no one has ever learned where they went. But Jake knows the truth. The Naha had been asleep, waiting for the screams of the Headless Men to wake them up. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps. I post short 90-second stories just about every night, and one deeper dive just like this one every week. So if you want more of these, subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week.